Use them. So our next speakers are Dr. Catherine Groves and Dr. James Holness. They are both from Swansea University. So Dr. Groves is from the School of Management and Dr. Holness from the College of Engineering. They'll be presenting to us on their implementation of a VR environment for an authentic learning experience. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do.
Something that reproduces hopefully what the students will encounter in a professional environment later. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is this actually working? Brilliant.
The monitor's James.
Yep. Okay.
Better? Cool.
Good morning. So, yep, this is going to be a double act today. So, thank you.
James
Thank you
has
for
got
joining
the
us.
first 10 minutes, so that was a tactical error on my part.
First 12, 13 minutes.
No, 10 minutes.
So, to infinity and beyond, slight misnomer. We should have called it Engage, and you'll see why shortly. But Dr. Catherine Groves and I have been working together on using VR, and also critical reflection together as a learning tool for some of our MSc students. So we have a group of MSc students who are working on a program called Sustainable Engineering Management for International Development, a little unwieldy, but those students spend a lot of time in the field, and when I say in the field, in sub-Saharan Africa in this case, they have a lot of challenges to face in the field, and we wanted to try and get some of those challenges across in a virtual environment, shall we say. Dr. Groves is a psychologist, so I know there's other psychologists here. I'm an engineer, kind of.
What could possibly go wrong?
So, there are a number of innovations we feel about this, and it's part of the reason we obviously want to talk about it, is the fact that what we're going to talk about is accessible. So it's something that's available to lots of people, and anyone can pretty much do it. There are limitations, but it's far more accessible than what I used to traditionally do. I used to work on leadership courses in the corporate sector, and I used to take people out mountain biking and climbing and archery, and there were limitations, and there were a lot of able-bodied people that couldn't do these exercises and these actions, but in this environment we feel it's far more accessible. It is very authentic. We can generate lots of real feelings, lots of real emotions, lots of real responses within the environment that we're using. It's geographically independent, and we can do this in any environment where we can set up the kit, and there is potential to make that even more expansive, and I'll go to that a bit later.
Do you think you might want to tell them exactly what it was we did? Because I'm aware that
I'm going to come to that in a second.
Okay.
I'm just going to talk around where I think it's innovation first.
Okay.
I did think about this through. It's equal. So again, I've talked about the fact that it's accessible. We're putting people in an immersive environment. Any of you guys that have done the VR experiences, you know how immersive these can. And it's a deep experience as well. And we use the critical reflection tool to give really a very, very deep understanding and a deep look at what it is that the participants are doing. And the idea of gamification, the idea of it being fun and enjoyable is really, really important as well in the learning idea. So now I will tell you the concept. So the idea is that we are running this module on leadership and team development. Okay? So there's theory supported by action learning and critical reflection. So that action learning, some classical theory in the first case around leadership, team development, communication, critical reflection, and then some action learning. And again, we do a number of physical and mental exercises traditionally, and we've replaced those with an immersive virtual reality experience. And then critical reflection. Now, I've incorrectly put that as a post-exercise diagnostic tool. It's not post-exercise, it's woven throughout. And we use the action learning, we actually use the immersive environment several times throughout the course, and the reflective accounts, the reflective aspect of it is re-engaged throughout the program and throughout the process. And Kath will talk to that a little later. So in detail, what we used was the Star Trek bridge game. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it's a commercially available game. There was no point in us writing something bespoke when we had access to this. We had a little dabble quite early on and discovered that it was actually quite a useful tool for us to use, for us to actually look at leadership, look at communication, look at team development, and give a nice environment in which to do that. For those of you who don't know, basically there's a range of missions. They increase in duration, they increase in complexity, and they have various objectives. And those test a number of different responses, but they certainly test your ability to work as a team, and they test your ability to lead. And they have a number of certain ethical quandaries and queries, and there are lots of different considerations that have to be made during the various missions. There's no doubt that they actually put a certain amount of stress on individuals and the group as part of that experience as well. So in terms of the exercise mechanics, we used a fairly standardized setup. The game is set up for 4 people. We ran it with 4 people. The course runs teams of 4, as it turns out. So we had 4 people effectively sitting down one of these desks, either with the Vive setup or with the Oculus Rift setup. Used the same software, slightly different interfaces, but fundamentally the same. There was always a technician there to support from a technical angle, but also there from a welfare viewpoint as well. And we did some fundamental screening and made sure that the students would be okay to use the equipment, okay to use the game. And that was the setup that we ran. And of course, it's relatively easily monitored in that environment. You can record it, you can watch what's going on. Within the game, you select a number of roles. So somebody takes the role of the sort of the formal leader, if you like, so somebody becomes the captain, somebody becomes the engineer, somebody takes the role as the tactician, who's effectively the weapons guy or gal, and then somebody takes the role of the helmsman.
Helmsman, that's
so the
one.
pilot.
They steer.
So somebody steering the ship, basically. You have to learn a number of specific tasks to each role, and somebody mentioned earlier that that is an aspect you have to consider. There is a learning stage to be able to use the game. And then each individual has specific data streams, so nobody gets the full picture. And that's what's really interesting about this. So this is one of the screenshots. So this is the captain's view. So the captain has a stream of data coming in. They get effectively a description of what the mission is. They tend to get far more information and have far less physical control over the ship, whereas the other aspects, the other roles, have a lot of control over different aspects of the ship. But effective communication is required because you don't all have control over everything. Nobody can make a full decision effectively on their own, and teamwork is required, and leadership is required. There are different approaches to how you manage it, and that's obviously part of what the course is about. But leadership is required from the captain, and we do have teams where that captain takes a full leadership role, and all of the other members of the team obediently follow that leader. There are other scenarios where that doesn't occur, more frequently than not, where everybody just does whatever they want to do. But there are requirements at times, because of the speed and the complexity of the environment, for individuals to take leadership roles or for leadership to be delegated from the leader in any case. So it creates a complex environment. And it's ideal, I think, actually, for testing some of these things. There is an element of problem solving, and the team has to work together to solve those problems. I've mentioned before, we can monitor and record the environment, which is very, very useful. And there is an element of physical interaction, both with the hardware and both physically and virtually. And this, again, is part of the interface. And I'm talking as quickly as I can. One example that I will mention, again, for any of you trekkers out there, there is the Kobayashi Maru. It's one of the scenarios in there. It's a no-win scenario, very, very complex environment where you're supposed to try and save the crew of a distressed ship. The ship is under fire by aliens, Klingons in this case, and those enemies start to attack you as you start to try and aid that ship. And
you've got an exploding star somewhere.
You've got all sorts of stuff exploding going on. But those enemies, they increase in number. You can't effectively defeat them all. You shoot one down, 2 more appears. It's a no-win scenario. But that particular environment creates a very, very stressful, complex environment for the captain and for the crew, and the decision-making very quickly can go out of the window. And watching how teams respond to that was fascinating. And as I said, the stress levels become really quite palpable in that environment. Leadership, communication very quickly collapses as the environment gets more complex. There are challenges in terms of using this type of kit. It's not cheap, many thousands of pounds in terms of initial setup, and seeing that go forward and reducing costs will be great. We are limited to the number of participants. We are running teams of 4. We did have technical issues. We use a remote server where this game is based, and if there's any kind of bandwidth issues, you're going to suffer a little bit. There are a number of skills that do need to be learnt. I mentioned that before. There's a couple of hours of sort of pre-learning to get used to the environment. This is questionable, but there is some, whether or not there's a reliance on some level of engagement. I do feel that to get the best out of this, you do have to engage with it and take it relatively seriously, I guess, to try and gain something from it. And the final one that I'll come to is the idea of it being an alien concept. Now, this addresses assumptions, and a number of assumptions that I had. I never considered the idea that somebody hadn't heard of Star Trek. More so, that they perhaps hadn't even been familiar or weren't familiar with the idea of science fiction. Now, there's a student from Ghana on our course. He didn't know what Star Trek was. He didn't know about the idea of there being this sort of environment where you might have fictional spacecraft shooting other fictional spacecraft in space. This guy hadn't particularly used a computer and certainly hadn't engaged through VR and through an Oculus Rift or anything like that. So very, very challenging for that individual, and there's probably a whole research paper in that particular area. At that point, I probably have run, so I'm going to hand over to Kath.
Yes, marvellous. Fantastic. So my bit of what I brought in, I was very excited by the whole Star Trek thing, and I'm sure you can start to see how that might provide an authentic learning environment for people who are starting to think about leadership and are expected to graduate into a leadership position. And the theoretical position that I took to start off with was one of action learning, because action learning requires thinking and doing. So it's a process that can be promoted when people are helped to reflect on their attitudes and what they bring to a real organisational problem. And a virtual organisational problem is nearly as good as a real organisational problem, especially when you think that these students will be finishing their master's degree by going into quite a risky physical environment in a developing country to develop technology or solve organisational problems there. So action learning is to do with doing, it's to do with critically reflecting, and it occurs within a context, a social and dynamic context. And the adoption of virtual reality allowed us to create that kind of social and dynamic context. And as far as action learning is concerned, that's very now in management teaching. It's considered that action learning embeds learning in a much more, in a much deeper level, in a way that students are able to lever and use much more readily when they move out into a work environment. But as Einstein said, not everything that matters counts, and not everything that can be counted matters. And it's harder to set up this kind of module, this kind of learning opportunity, this kind of assessment using critical reflection and virtual reality. That's much more difficult to set up than a more traditional assessment method. So for those of you who are not familiar with critical reflection, I kind of rush off and assume that everyone is. Critical reflection, it stresses the importance of both the educational content, so what we're giving them, but also the methods and structures that we're using to help those students access that. So we're helping them to critically reflect, and then to think about how that works. So Reynolds says that critical reflection differs from other forms of reflection in 4 ways. So it helps students to challenge their taken for granted assumptions. There's a focus on power relations, and the reason I'm listing these is because I'm going to go through and show you those. There's a focus on the social rather than the individual nature of learning. And there is also an emancipatory agenda, which sounds a bit grand, but hopefully I'll help you to see how that fits. So critical reflection is associated with a much deeper understanding. So it's not just about the what, it's about the who, the why, and the how. If I can just take you in your minds, I don't have a virtual reality application for this, but who's been to a safari park? You go through the safari park and you've got the giraffes that kind of wander out, and you've got the camels that sit on your car, and all the things which are really in your face and really obvious. But there's always, as you drive through, there's always that cage in the distance that's got a plaque on it that you can't quite read and you're not quite sure what lives there, and everyone's looking and you go, it says it should be wolves, but no one can see any wolves. And then as you're looking, almost like a magic picture, everything kind of comes into focus, and one person in the car can see it, and they go, oh, it's the wolf, I can see it, it looks like this, it's over in that corner, if you look here you can see its nose. Anyone with me? Yeah, it's a bit of smiling and nodding, that's good. So that happens, and once someone's seen it, everyone else can see it. And the process of critical reflection is a little bit like that. So by going actually below the surface, it helps us to gain a much deeper understanding of whatever it is we're experiencing. So this is where James and I had a bit of a disagreement, hard to believe, but actually true. He said actually they need to be properly engaged with it. I don't believe, obviously that's ideal, but even if the student doesn't fully engage with the leadership VR experience, the process of critically reflecting on that will help them to understand much more about themselves. So, questioning taken for granted assumptions. I've got 5 minutes, that's all right, I'm halfway through. So, a lot of our students came with the assumption that the issue in engaging in VR was actually it was to win the game. I'm going to get the highest score. And it wasn't about that at all. And the stronger students started to think, actually, what is the who? What is the how? What is the why? What is it I'm supposed to be getting out of this? Who are my team? How can I get the best out of them? How can I get the best out of myself? So the critical reflection element allowed them to delve into that. The focus was on social rather than individual learning. So it was innately freeing because these guys started to realise that they didn't have the full picture. So there was a complementary amount of information around the room that they had to cooperate to lever. And then there was one student who'd written a presentation, because we asked them to do a presentation after they'd been in the VR on their critical reflection, and then we gave them some feedback. There was one student who'd produced a beautiful presentation, and he wandered in, he was about fifth out of 8, and he put his notes down, and then he stood and he struggled with himself, and I thought, oh crap, what's going to happen? And then he's like this, and I thought, oh dear, he's really upset. And he went, you know what, I've spent hours doing this, and I've just realised that actually that's all about what we did, and this is about so much more than that. And so he then extemporised, and all the students in the room, it was quite a moving process. And that student came to me after the course, and he said, Kath, that module changed my life. And I've never had that kind of feedback from a student after a course. It's about the analysis of power relations. I don't have time to show you that clip, but coming into, I'm going to have to flip through, coming into a third world country and delivering a project, there are definite power imbalances. You're a Westerner coming into a developing country, you're expected to have lots of money. These are themes that emerge from the student presentations, and here are some quotes. I saw dramatic changes through the communication between the two games. It allowed me to develop personally as well as academically. It was about understanding the why and how of situations rather than explaining the situations themselves. And in terms of going forward, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. We could think about some bespoke software. We could think about writing something with very focused outcomes, very focused objectives, and to try and give very focused responses from students, so that we can move in terms of what we actually utilise. There is the potential to do this remotely. we don't have to be teaching this in one little classroom. The beauty of this is we can teach it anywhere. There are
And multiple sites as
in
well.
multiple sites. Certainly at the moment I'm talking with international partners in China about the idea of them setting up classrooms so they could actually participate at the same time as our students are participating here. There are of course issues around that, but some of them are actually automatically overcome in terms of some of the language issues. So it's quite interesting. And something else we'd like to pursue is looking at some of the physical responses and mental responses to this. There's lots of people here doing sensor development. And actually the physical response to some of these environments, these artificial environments, would be fascinating. So,
Thank you. There's some references. We're happy to take questions, and I've also got a few action plans that students have produced as a result of the work that they engaged in. Phew.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I can see some people already with questions.
Cool.
So, I'm going to start with you, sir.
Thanks for the talk. On the cultural factors, you mentioned you're going to partner with Sweden and China. Do you anticipate any cultural factors in the notion of people being able to collaborate? So I know just in a anecdotal sense, some cultures can be more submissive in the sense that they expect whoever the coordinator is to do everything they were told. Do you anticipate any issues with that, how that might impact your study? Second bit is,
Would you want us to answer that one first?
yeah, okay.
I think we actually saw cultural issues emerging through the critical reflection. We did a bit of teaching, we put them in virtual reality, we got them to do critically reflective presentations, which they then fed back to one another about, and then they had to go away and do a critically reflective piece. And as they were giving the critically reflective presentations, it was really obvious that some people were much more submissive, some people were coming from very different places, but we were able to help to start to shape that behaviour through the critical reflection. So I do think that there will be issues, as you've pointed out, initially, but I think the interventions that we carry out subsequently can help to shape that behaviour